Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've been trying to make sense of the past year in politics and finance, you know the signal-to-noise ratio has been, well, pretty brutal.
It really has.
Today, we are strapping in for a high-velocity, high-detail tour through the defining events of 2025. It's been a year marked by, historic government gridlock, unprecedented economic interventions from the top down, and some truly shocking political upsets from the bottom up.
That's right. We've synthesized sources covering, well, everything from these high-stakes national trade wars and a record-breaking government shutdown to the formal institutional embrace of cryptocurrency and that historic socialist mayoral victory in New York City.
Quite a mix.
Definitely. Our mission here is to try and connect these seemingly disparate policy shifts and market reactions. We want to understand the current financial and political climate and, crucially, what it all means for you, for your personal wealth, and maybe your investment strategy.
Exactly. We're going to highlight 4 critical areas for you. First, this new era of trade warfare, right? Ushered in by sweeping tariffs, but also paired with massive tax incentives designed to fundamentally reshape where and how goods are made.
A real carrot-and-stick approach.
Second, we'll track how political gridlock, specifically that shutdown, resulted in billions in hard costs and pretty volatile market signals.
Big consequence there.
Third, we cover the seismic shift toward cryptocurrency, not just as an investment, but as a political instrument almost, designed to protect wealth.
Yeah, that's a fascinating angle.
And finally, we'll analyze how a stunning municipal election, that NYC race, signaled some really deep national political fault lines. So let's try and unpack this new landscape. Okay, so we have to start with the aggressive repositioning of U.S. trade policy this year. I mean, this move was so dramatic, it fundamentally altered global supply chains almost overnight. In April 2025, President Trump invoked a rarely used and incredibly powerful tool, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
Right, IEPA.
He declared that foreign trade and economic practices were creating a national emergency. What's the significance of using IEPA for a trade policy shift, and what was the immediate result?
Well, invoking IEPA is really significant because it grants the president almost unchecked authority to regulate international commerce during a declared national emergency. It basically sidesteps the normal congressional debate process.
Well, usually for sanctions, right?
Exactly. It's typically reserved for sanctioning hostile nations or, combating terrorism, not just adjusting import duties across the board. So using it here signals the administration views the trade deficit as this kind of existential threat requiring emergency action.
Yeah.
The resulting order immediately imposed a blanket 10% tariff on all goods from all countries. That started April 5th, 2025.
Wow. Okay. 10% baseline, hitting everyone equally. That's significant in itself. But the mechanism didn't stop there, did it?
It didn't, no. Just 4 days later, April 9th, an individualized reciprocal higher tariff was imposed on specific countries. These were the ones identified as having the largest trade deficits with the U.S.
The reciprocal part.
Yes, that reciprocal element is key. The stated goal here is to enforce reciprocity, right, and combat what the administration characterizes as unfair policies, things like massive trade deficits, currency manipulation aimed at making their exports cheaper, and those exorbitant value-added taxes, VATs, imposed by partners like the EU that disadvantage U.S. exports.
And the sources we look at are really clear about the scale of the problem the administration felt it had to address.
Yeah.
We're talking about that massive 2024 goods trade deficit exceeding $1.2 trillion.
Yeah, $1.2 trillion.
The narrative is basically that this is an unsustainable crisis that prior administrations just ignored.
Exactly. And the stated reasons for the emergency declaration go straight to the decline of American industrial capacity. They cite these persistent trade deficits as the cause of the, quote, hollowing out of the U.S. manufacturing base. And the data they use to support this narrative is pretty stark. U.S. manufacturing output as a share of global output dropped sharply, from about 28.4% back in 2001 down to 17.4% in 2023.
That's a big drop.
It is. The administration explicitly argued that this decline undermines critical supply chains and that fragility was brutally exposed first during COVID-19,
Right.
and then again during disruptions like the Houthi attacks on Middle East shipping lanes. Those events really demonstrated how dependent the U.S. is on global maritime security and these long supply chains.
So this is framed as both an economic crisis and a national security issue, kind of rolled into one.
Precisely.
But it's not just about production capacity, is it? The justification also targets massive intellectual property theft and counterfeit goods.
That's a key piece of it, yeah. A key piece of the justification for using the Emergency Act. The administration cites estimates that the annual cost to the U.S. economy from counterfeit goods, pirated software, and just outright theft of trade secrets. Well, the range is huge, from $225 billion up to maybe $600 billion a year.
Wow, $600 billion.
It's a massive range, but even the low end is staggering. And when you realize that the global trade in counterfeit pharmaceuticals alone is estimated at, what, $4.4 billion, and is directly linked to the distribution of deadly fentanyl-laced drugs originating from specific countries? Well, the administration connects this economic theft directly to threats to U.S. security, health, and safety. That's how they justify using IEPA.
Okay, that makes sense in terms of framing. Now, when you drop tariffs this broadly, businesses immediately start looking for loopholes for exemptions. What were the notable carve-outs from this new reciprocal tariff regime, and what do they tell us about the administration's strategic priorities?
Yeah, there were several critical exemptions. They primarily focused on articles deemed strategically essential or those already covered by existing protective measures. So this included items already subject to Section 232 tariffs, like steel and aluminum, and auto parts.
Right, those were already in place.
Yeah, correct. More revealingly, though, the order also exempted copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, bullion, and certain energy and minerals not available domestically in sufficient quantities.
Hmm. Why carve out semiconductors and pharmaceuticals? I mean, those are often cited as major areas where supply chains must be reshored.
Well, it really highlights a strategic tension, doesn't it? While the overall goal is broad reshoring, these industries are just hyper-globalized. Cutting off foreign supplies immediately would cripple the domestic market and, frankly, national security interests.
Okay.
So they carved out pharmaceuticals and semiconductors specifically to protect these critical, often outsourced supply chains. Because the immediate disruption of these goods, I mean, think basic drug supplies or the advanced chips needed for an F-35 fighter jet, the risk is simply too high, even as they simultaneously try to create incentives to bring that production back eventually.
So manage the immediate risk while applying long-term pressure.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. Short-term risk management while the broader tariffs create that long-term pressure for change. So, whenever tariffs of this scale are enacted, the debate instantly zeroes in on the consumer, right? Will prices rise? Will the economy stall?
The usual questions, yeah.
And the administration's argument here, summarized as tariffs work, is supported by studies they cite. These studies suggest tariffs are effective tools for both national security and economic objectives. It's basically rejecting decades of the free trade consensus.
And the sources cited by the administration directly challenge that conventional wisdom, the idea that tariffs are simply taxes on consumers. We saw a report from the U.S. International Trade Commission analyzing previous tariffs, the Section 232 and 301 tariffs.
Yeah,
And it found they successfully stimulated U.S. production of the tariffed goods with only minor sort of overall effects on consumer prices. That's a powerful data point for the pro-tariff side.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from just consumer price indexing and towards production capacity. The administration also cites a 2024 economic analysis that projected a global 10% tariff would actually grow the U.S. economy by $728 billion.
Wow.
Create 2.8 million jobs, and increase real household incomes by a pretty substantial 5.7%. Proponents argue that, the increased domestic competition and the tax revenue generated offset potential price increases.
And politically, this was fascinating. They cited former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen.
Yeah, that was quite a move. They gained a lot of political leverage by publicly citing Janet Yellen from last year, affirming that she didn't believe American consumers would see any meaningful increase in prices from tariffs.
Using a former opposition figure's assessment to validate their core strategy. That's quite something.
It is.
So the stated motivation, then, is clearly to reverse that steep decline in manufacturing output we mentioned earlier. It's an explicit mechanism designed to incentivize businesses to reshore production.
Precisely. This is about leveraging these new duties to adjust for the perceived unfairness in global trade. It provides a clear, massive financial incentive to reshore production that was lost to countries with, say, lower wages or more manipulative currency practices. The administration views the U.S. as needing to counter these non-tariff barriers like the local content requirements Indonesia imposes or India's complex duties on chemicals. They're doing it through this reciprocal tariff system. It essentially forces a confrontation to either compel fair access for American exports or, failing that, force production back onto American soil. This is really the heart of the America First economic agenda in practice. Hashtag TAGPAG 1.3 tax cuts and personal wealth growth projections.
Okay, so moving from tariffs, border taxes, essentially to income tax relief. The administration is pairing these aggressive trade measures with a potential package of deep tax cuts. This includes extending the low rates and the increased standard deduction from the hallmark 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA.
Right, extending the TCJA cuts.
So it creates this environment where you're kind of punished for sourcing abroad, but heavily rewarded for building at home.
Yeah, the intention seems to be creating a massive supply-side stimulus to match the border protection. The Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA, has issued some highly optimistic projections for the benefits flowing directly to workers and families from this proposed tax package, especially when you combine it with the specific business incentives aimed at reshoring.
Let's break down those CEA projections because the numbers suggest a huge boost to the average listener's pocketbook. What is the CEA forecasting for, the American worker and the American family?
The projections are, well, quite dramatic. For long-run real wages, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, the projections suggest an increase somewhere between $6,100 and $11,627 higher.
Per year.
Higher annual wages in the long run, yes. And then when you factor in both those expected wage increases and the proposed income tax reductions from extending the low TCJ rates, the total family take-home pay is projected to be $7,800 to $13,300 higher per year.
$13,000 higher.
That's the high end of the projection range, yeah. It captures the cumulative impact of all these provisions, assuming, full implementation and the full economic response they expect.
Those are staggering figures.
Yeah.
And the short-run impact on the job market is also projected to be huge.
It is. The total package of tax proposals is estimated to save or create somewhere between 6.6 and 7.4 million full-time equivalent jobs in the short run.
Wow.
And much of this is driven by very specific business incentives aimed at tangible investment in manufacturing and R&D. That's the core priority, right? Driving reshoring and increasing domestic capacity.
So what are those specific targeted business incentives causing these projections to surge? Are they just broad tax reductions, or are they aimed at specific types of investment?
They are highly targeted, actually. They focus heavily on depreciation rules. The package emphasizes two key forms of full expensing. First, permanently instituting full expensing for equipment investment and R&D.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
It's crucial because it reverses the costly switch to amortization that started back in 2022. It allows businesses to immediately deduct 100% of these costs equipment, R&D, in the year they incur them. This reduces their upfront tax liability and boosts crucial cash flow for reinvestment.
Got it. And the second incentive specifically targets the construction boom needed for reshoring, right?
Precisely. There's a temporary full expensing provision specifically for new factory construction. It applies to construction starting before 2029 and placed in service before 2033. This is a massive carrot for large manufacturing firms thinking about building new plants in the U.S.
Right.
The CEA estimates this factory expensing provision alone could surge short-run investment by a substantial 4.9% to 7.0%. So you see the coordinated economic policy here. Trade policy uses the stick of tariffs to discourage foreign sourcing, while tax policy uses the carrot of immediate deductions and potential massive wage boosts to incentivize domestic construction and hiring. It's a cohesive, if controversial, strategy.
Okay, now, shifting gears dramatically. Those bold economic promises from the administration ran straight into, well, the brick wall of political gridlock in the fall. We saw the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, surpassing the 35-day impasse of 2018-2019.
Yeah, this was a Democrat-led shutdown lasting an unprecedented 41 days. It stretched from October 1st all the way to November 10th, 2025.
41 days.
And the core conflict was highly polarized. It really revolved around extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies. That was a key Democratic demand, which the Senate repeatedly rejected and House passed continuing resolutions. So the fight wasn't just about funding levels. It was fundamentally about the structure of America's social safety net.
And regardless of, whose legislative maneuver technically caused the halt, the economic damage was immediate and substantial. For the listener trying to manage their finances, what were the hard, immediate costs of this 41-day impasse, and what did the CBO estimate for the long term?
Well, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, projected a severe impact on the macroeconomy. It's estimated to have reduced annualized real GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2025 by somewhere between 1.0 and 2.0 percentage points.
That's a big hit to growth.
It's a significant deceleration, yeah. More concerning, perhaps, is the potential permanent loss to the nation's economic output. That was projected to range from $7 billion up to $14 billion. That's economic activity that's just not recovered even after operations resume.
$14 billion potentially just gone.
Gone. And on the ground, you had approximately 900,000 federal employees furloughed. That severely impacted essential services across the board.
Could you provide a bit more detail on the specific services that were paralyzed?
Yeah.
Beyond just the human impact for those employees, what parts of the federal apparatus really ground to a halt?
Sure. Beyond the furloughing of staff who administer programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and Head Start, you had crucial operational areas just ceasing function. Air traffic controller training stalled, for instance, increasing backlogs and raising safety concerns down the line.
Right.
National parks were left unstaffed. But the impact stretched deep into commerce and finance, too. The IRS delayed processing tax claims, which affected business cash flow. Small businesses relying on SBA loans couldn't get approvals processed. It's this cumulative disruption that led to the CBO's projection of permanent loss. Because the timing of economic opportunities, think about the Q4 holiday spending ramp up, it gets missed, and you just can't regain that lost time.
So even after a resolution was reached on November 10th, these deep operational disruptions don't just vanish overnight. What were the most significant lingering consequences for businesses, particularly those operating in highly regulated sectors or, say, government contracting?
The regulatory backlogs are a major issue. They continue long after the lights theoretically turn back on. Agencies like the FDA, for example, suspended routine inspections and significantly slowed down new product approvals.
Right. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, so for pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, this meant market entry for new, potentially very profitable drugs was delayed. That translates directly into deferred revenue and, naturally, investor uncertainty.
And for finance?
Well, financial institutions face challenges because the timely release of critical government economic data, things like inflation statistics, employment figures, was suspended. Until normal reporting resumed, market participants were basically operating with incomplete information, which tends to increase risk premiums.
Makes sense. And in the long term, what does a record-breaking shutdown like this signal to the broader business community and maybe to global financial markets looking at the U.S.?
Fundamentally, it signals systemic political fragility, an inability to govern consistently. This instability causes an erosion of confidence that has lasting implications, especially for investors considering long-term commitments to the U.S. The pervasive expectation now among some analysts is that this uncertainty will lead to increased costs for government contractors. They might feel they now have to pad their contracts, essentially, against the risk of future instability and potential non-payment.
Building in a risk premium for political dysfunction.
Pretty much. This whole episode confirmed that the U.S. political system's ability to consistently fund its own operations is a persistent and now clearly demonstrated risk factor. Hashtag 2.2 stock market trends and high-stakes predictions.
Okay, so despite all that volatility and the severe economic drag from the shutdown, the stock market continued to provide some dramatic policy-driven opportunities. We saw a general consensus emerge. High volatility, yes, but specific sectors stood to gain significantly under the new policy direction.
That's the classic high-risk, high-reward market you often see under this type of administration, right? Gains aren't distributed evenly. They're very specific and policy-driven. We've identified 3 key sectors that seemed poised for growth based on those policy signals. First, defense and aerospace.
Makes sense.
Yeah. The promise of significantly increased spending on strengthening the military typically boosts major contractors like Lockheed Martin, LMT, and Northrop Grumman, NOC. Pretty straightforward there.
And second, financial services seem like an obvious winner too, capitalizing on both deregulation talk and interest rate dynamics.
Absolutely. The promise of deregulation, may be building on previous efforts to roll back parts of the Dodd-Frank Act, could significantly boost profitability for large banks like JP Morgan Chase, JPM, and Wells Fargo, WFC. Furthermore, if the Federal Reserve maintains elevated interest rates due to persistent inflationary pressures, which, many economists expect, given the expansive fiscal policies these banks stand to generate even more net interest revenue from loans and mortgages, that benefits their bottom lines directly.
Okay. The third sector, AI and technology, is interesting because it faces this kind of dual pressure, right? Infrastructure support and big government contracts on one hand, but potential trade restrictions on the other.
Correct. Long-term growth remains pretty undeniable for foundational companies like, say, Palantir, PLTR, which specializes in government data contracts, and NVIDIA, NVDA, the chip giant. These companies could benefit massively from domestic infrastructure investments and a government push for technological superiority. But investors have to constantly weigh that upside against the serious risk of export restrictions, specifically restrictions on critical AI technology going to adversarial nations. That could severely limit the global growth opportunities for these chip makers and software providers. It's a balancing act for investors, too.
Right. Speaking of high stakes and policy-driven gains, we have to revisit that truly explosive investment prediction made by billionaire investor and administration supporter Bill Ackman. This prediction seemed based entirely on a reading of the political and tax environment.
Yes. Ackman predicted a massive surge for two specific government-sponsored real estate entities: Fannie Mae, the Federal National Mortgage Association, and Freddie Mac, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation. He forecast that these two stocks could soar by over 900% under the new regime.
Over 900%. That's just astonishing. What's the specific policy mechanism driving that predicted gain? How could that even happen?
Well, it centers on how the corporate tax cuts interact with their unique history from the bailout era. During the 2008 financial crisis, these entities, Fannie and Freddie, were taken into government conservatorship.
Right, basically nationalized.
Essentially, yeah. Ackman's theory is that the new administration and the Treasury Department will restructure their relationship with the government, potentially allowing them to retain a much larger percentage of their profits and maybe even exit conservatorship eventually. Critically, the deep corporate tax cuts outlined in the administration's tax package dramatically change their projected tax liability. That improves their profitability forecast to such an extent that, in Ackman's view, it justifies this dramatic potential valuation increase.
So it's a very high conviction bet based entirely on political decisions and tax policy shifts.
Exactly. It's contingent upon executive branch cooperation and following through on those tax plans. A very specific policy-driven bet.
Moving now to another massive shift in 2025, the formal embrace of decentralized currency by the executive branch. President Trump made cryptocurrency a core tenet of his administration, not just viewing it as an asset, but almost as a political tool, vowing to make the U.S. the crypto capital of the planet. I mean, this is a profound shift in political philosophy.
It is a remarkable turnaround, isn't it? It marks a fundamental policy realignment that seems to appeal directly to the libertarian and anti-establishment wings of the party. And we saw concrete legislative action with the signing of the Genius Act.
Right, the Genius Act. What did that do?
It establishes a clear federal regulatory framework specifically around stablecoins. This is critical because it signals that the government intends to integrate these dollar-pegged private sector digital assets into the financial framework, effectively treating them like highly regulated, digitally native money market funds.
So that gives stablecoins a degree of legitimacy they perhaps lacked before, protecting users and maybe institutions who want to use them.
Precisely. But beyond legislation, the institutional commitment goes straight into the administration's inner circle and even its corporate empire. Trump Media and Technology Group, trading as DJT, announced a massive $2 billion investment in Bitcoin and Bitcoin-related securities.
$2 billion. How much of their assets is that?
That represents 2/3 of their liquid assets, according to the announcement.
Wow, 2/3 in Bitcoin.
Yeah. And that investment decision was explicitly framed as a strategic necessity rooted in political defense. The company stated the holdings help ensure their financial freedom and protect them against potential discrimination by financial institutions.
A clear reference to the risk of being debanked.
Exactly. Or otherwise marginalized due to political association. They characterize the Bitcoin holdings as a necessary hedge against potential political or financial retaliation. This connects crypto directly to personal and political liberty, which has become a major talking point for the administration.
And this pro-crypto sentiment is clearly shared by members of the inner circle, cabinet nominees, making it seem like a stable policy direction, not just a passing enthusiasm.
Yes, absolutely. Key figures haven't just endorsed crypto, they've disclosed holdings. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, for instance, holds between $250,000 and $500,000 in Bitcoin based on his federal disclosure forms.
Okay.
Additionally, Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor nominee, held Bitcoin back in 2023. This is more than just investment. These figures are actively characterizing Bitcoin as the currency of freedom. They call it a vital hedge against inflation for, middle-class Americans, and even an off-ramp from a ruinous national debt.
An off-ramp from the national debt.
That's the framing. They view it as a political tool to bypass what they see as government overreach and fiscal mismanagement. Hashtag 3.2 Bitcoin as an inflation hedge and the challenge to fiat. To truly understand why crypto appeals so strongly now to high-level policymakers and investors alike, you really have to trace the foundational critique of the U.S. financial system, and that centers on the 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement. This is the historical context that makes Bitcoin seem so relevant today.
Right. That was the moment President Nixon unilaterally ended the dollar's formal fixed peg to gold. How did that seismic event set the stage for Bitcoin decades later? Why is 1971 still the key date people bring up?
Well, by suspending the right of foreign governments to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate, Nixon essentially enabled the shift to a pure fiat system, a system where the supply of currency could be expanded indefinitely by political will, not tied to a physical asset. This intrinsically enables deficit spending without the restraint of a hard asset backing the currency. As one source we looked at put it, post-1971, policymakers inevitably face this kind of Solomonic choice. They must either protect Americans from inflation or protect the government's ability to engage in massive deficit spending.
You can't do both.
The argument is they cannot sustainably do both, because the former requires fiscal restraint and the latter requires monetary expansion, which tends to fuel inflation. The immediate consequence of the Nixon shock back then was severe. The dollar lost more than half its purchasing power just between June 1971 and December 1980.
Wow, half its value in less than a decade.
Exactly. That's the historical precedent driving today's crypto narrative.
And today, with unprecedented national debt and persistent inflation concerns, the declining faith in U.S. credit is being voiced by major financial leaders. It suggests we might be living through another period where the dollar's long-term stability is, well, suspect.
Absolutely. The analogy used is quite striking. When the interest rate on the benchmark 10-year Treasury bond is lower than the expected inflation rate, investors holding that bond are effectively guaranteed to lose money in inflation-adjusted terms.
Right.
You have hedge fund leaders like Ray Dalio, who was famously a Bitcoin skeptic for a long time, now publicly stating they'd rather own Bitcoin than a Treasury bond in certain environments. And MicroStrategy CEO Michael Saylor uses that evocative analogy that the value of today's Treasury bonds is like a melting ice cube due to this guaranteed inflation-adjusted loss.
Oh, melting ice cube. Yeah, that paints a picture.
It does. This isn't just theory. It's driving an active search by large pools of capital for what they perceive as a superior store of value.
So how does Bitcoin directly address this risk for ordinary Americans versus just institutional investors? The narrative often focuses on high net worth individuals, but proponents argue it's a tool for everyone.
Well, the central function of Bitcoin's design, its fixed supply capped at 21 million coins, is intended to enable ordinary Americans. Maybe retirees on fixed incomes, hourly wage earners whose salaries often lag inflation, to protect their savings from government mismanagement and inflation.
How so?
The idea is, back in 1971, Americans had no real recourse when Washington effectively debased the dollar. Today, with the supply of Bitcoin algorithmically capped, it offers a decentralized digital hedge. Its value is determined by scarcity and network effect, proponents argue, not by the government's borrowing habits or monetary policy decisions. So it's framed as improving financial security for vulnerable groups who are often disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis driven by inflation.
And we even saw a pretty radical policy suggestion in our sources aimed at the government itself. The idea that the Treasury Department should consider replacing 10% of its existing gold holdings with a U.S. strategic Bitcoin reserve.
That suggestion, if it were ever implemented, would be a stunning acknowledgement of Bitcoin's geopolitical neutrality and its potential maturity as a reserve asset.
What's the logic behind it?
It's based on the idea that if Bitcoin continues to appreciate strongly against both gold and the dollar, holding such a reserve would actually help shore up the Treasury's balance sheet. It could potentially decrease the need for perpetual monetary inflation to paper over deficits down the line.
Interesting.
The sources arguing for this suggest that instead of desperately trying to restrict Bitcoin, federal policymakers should perhaps embrace its role. Ensure the U.S. leads globally in accumulating Bitcoin-based wealth and innovation, effectively hedging its own risk against the possibility of long-term dollar devaluation. It's the ultimate concession, really, that the existing fiat system faces some inherent challenges.
Okay, so while the federal government was deeply focused on tariffs, taxes, and tech policy, the political landscape was being radically reshaped at the municipal level, specifically with the truly shocking result of the 2025 New York City mayoral race.
This victory was genuinely historic, wasn't it? It signaled a profound shift in urban democratic politics. Zohran Mamdani, a self-described democratic socialist and an immigrant from Uganda, won the general election with 50.39% of the vote.
And that was only possible after he first defeated former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary.
Right, a feat that would have been almost unthinkable even 5 years ago. And Cuomo didn't just go away. He continued to run in the general election under his own third-party line, Fight and Deliver, and he still pulled a significant 41.59% of the total vote.
The fact that Cuomo, a registered Democrat, former state powerhouse, running on an independent line, garnered that much support really speaks to the deep division within the city. But Mamdani's victory is clearly a shift toward a more populist socialist platform. What about his background and his platform resonated so strongly with voters?
Well, Mamdani's identity became a centerpiece of the campaign, both for supporters and detractors. He's the son of a Muslim father and a Hindu mother, born in Kampala, Uganda, but raised in New York. His platform was laser-focused on issues of affordability, housing equity, and the general cost of living issues that obviously affect vast swaths of New York City residents. His background as a foreclosure prevention counselor in Queens also lent credibility to his focus on tenants' rights and housing mandates.
Right. Practical experience.
Exactly. And he explicitly connected his win to a larger historical progressive movement. He started his victory speech by quoting the socialist Eugene Debs, and he borrowed a hopeful metaphor from India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, noting that this was a moment when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance.
What were the specifics of his policy proposals, though? The things that galvanized his base but maybe terrified the establishment? It wasn't just a general call for progressivism, was it?
No. His proposals were highly specific and quite interventionist. For housing, the platform included measures for mandatory unionization for new housing construction projects. It called for expanding rent stabilization rules to cover more units and implementing strict requirements for affordable housing mandates tied to all new development.
Okay, quite different from the status quo.
Very different. And for wealth redistribution, he proposed things like municipal wealth taxes and higher commercial property taxes, specifically aimed at large corporate entities. The idea was to use that revenue to fund universal services like childcare and transit improvements. Supporters viewed his approach as necessary to realign city leadership away from entrenched real estate and financial interests and more towards the needs of the general populace. Hashtag 4.2 campaign controversies and external reactions. Now, Mamdani's high-profile identity and his progressive policies meant the campaign was, unsurprisingly, steeped in intense political attacks. They often focused on his Muslim faith and immigrant background, attempting to paint him as too radical, too other for the city.
Yeah, the sources report a definite surge in Islamophobic attacks against his campaign. How did the opposition specifically deploy those tactics? What did that look like?
The political attacks were often, thinly veiled. A super PIC supporting Cuomo ran a really controversial ad depicting Mamdani standing in front of the Twin Towers. Yeah, implicitly linking him to the events of 9/11 and trying to raise national security concerns. It was a classic dog whistle tactic. Other flyers and social media campaigns artificially thickened and enlarged his beard and photos to make him appear more menacing and foreign. Mamdani, who was actually a dual citizen of the U.S. and Uganda, had to publicly address these accusations repeatedly. He vowed in his victory speech that he would no longer be in the shadows, highlighting the difficulty of running as a progressive, outspoken Muslim politician in America today.
There was also that strange controversy regarding his self-identification on an old college application that opponents seized on wasn't there.
That's right. The New York Times reported on Mamdani's unsuccessful 2009 application to Columbia University, where he had checked both the Asian and the Black or African American boxes on the form.
Okay.
He stated this was done simply to accurately represent his complex Indian-Ugandan background, given the limited options typically provided on those forms. But opponents seized on this, calling it potentially fraudulent and suggesting it was an attempt to somehow game admissions rules.
And his defenders.
His defenders dismissed it as either perfectly legitimate ethnic self-identification in a complex world or just a trivial political distraction. But it served its purpose for the opposition, keeping the narrative focused on his identity rather than his policy platform.
And the housing issue, which was so central to his platform, also became a point of personal attack when Cuomo falsely claimed Mamdani lived in a rent-controlled apartment.
Exactly. Cuomo's claim, which turned out to be false, Mamdani lived in a rent-stabilized apartment, not rent-controlled. A key legal difference was designed to be politically explosive. It suggested the socialist candidate was somehow benefiting personally from a limited housing resource, potentially at the expense of others in need.
Right.
Cuomo even claimed Mamdani's tenancy was responsible for a single mother sleeping in a homeless shelter. While that was debunked, it sparked a much larger and actually relevant debate. Cuomo's associated proposal to start means-testing rent-stabilized apartments was immediately panned by most housing experts. But the whole controversy highlighted the profound fault line in the city over who should benefit from housing cost regulation and whether it should be based on need or simply tenure in a unit.
Finally, how did the financial and political establishment react to this massive upset? I mean, a democratic socialist winning in the country's financial capital.
It immediately sent jitters through the NYC luxury real estate market, as one source put it. The election was viewed by many in that sector as a direct threat to capital flight and property values.
Understandably.
And the sheer concentration of political and financial support that failed to stop him was really noteworthy. Former Mayor Michael Bloomberg spent millions backing Cuomo. Even President Trump weighed in from Florida, publicly advising New York businesses considering relocating to view Miami as a refuge from the election result. The combined endorsements for Cuomo, from established Democrats like the incumbent mayor Eric Adams, to financial heavyweights like Bill Ackman, tech icon Elon Musk, and even former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly, all of that failed to halt the democratic socialist wave. It really indicated a profound ideological shift in the city's political core, one that traditional money and power structures couldn't stop this time.
Yeah, socialists taking City Hall, despite the combined weight of New York's traditional power brokers. And at the same time, the federal government is focused on deep tax cuts and deregulation. It really underscores that 2025 was a year where voters, both nationally and locally, seemed to be actively seeking fundamental change, whether that change was driven by deregulation and tariffs or by democratic socialism and decentralized currency.
That's really the core conflict we've seen play out all year, isn't it? We've explored this highly volatile 2025 marked by simultaneous, often conflicting shifts. You have these top-down economic interventions, massive tariffs, sweeping tax cuts designed to spur growth and reshoring, running parallel to these bottom-up political and financial disruptions, the longest government shutdown in history, the socialist rise in NYC, and the mainstream adoption of decentralized crypto, partly as a defense mechanism against government-driven inflation.
And the impact on your personal finances, listening to this, is immediate and tangible. You might be tracking that potential $7,800 to $13,300 boost in long-run take-home pay projected by the CEA from the tax cuts.
Right, potential upside.
Or you might be grappling with the reality of $7 billion to $14 billion permanent GDP loss caused by legislative gridlock. These massive, often contradictory shifts are defining the current economic landscape. They're forcing citizens and investors alike to find alternative strategies for stability.
And this brings us right back to the core tension that really defined this deep dive. Given that Bitcoin's surging acceptance, even among parts of the political elite, seems fundamentally driven by a widespread lack of trust in governments, including the U.S. government, to manage deficit spending responsibly. And the new administration is simultaneously promising massive tax cuts and unprecedented tariff intervention, both of which have huge fiscal implications. Well, we're left with a critical question for you to consider. How long can the government continue to reassure the public about the stability and creditworthiness of the dollar while simultaneously relying on the very deficit spending and potentially inflationary policies that decentralized currency was arguably invented to combat?
Hmm.
It really raises the question of whether this political push for centralized economic control through tariffs and tax policy is actually, paradoxically, accelerating its own fundamental failure as citizens increasingly seek refuge in alternative, trustless systems like crypto. Are we watching a return to centralized economic control, or are we actually witnessing its limits being tested like never before?